as well for hosting this. So my research very broadly tries to bridge philosophy and psychology. And today I'm just going to tell you about one sort of sub-strand of my work, which has to do with explanations. So to help motivate this, I want to start with an example, which comes from the website edge.org, which some of you might be familiar with. Let's make sure this works now.
There's your voice for the mic.
Yeah. It was working until now.
Yeah, I turned it off.
You turned it off.
You said that.
On-off switch, very important, thank you. So every year the website edge.org poses a question to dozens of scholars and artists and intellectuals of various kinds. And fortunately for me, the question for 2012 was, what is your favorite deep, elegant, or beautiful explanation? So they had almost 200 responses to this question from all sorts of people, scientists of different kinds, writers, artists, and so on, including many that you've probably heard of. What was really fascinating to me is that if you looked at their responses, in some ways they were incredibly diverse. Some people cited explanations from quantum mechanics, and others from evolutionary biology, and others from psychology and neuroscience, and so on. But they also had some trends that were remarkably common across these responses, not so much in the content of the explanations, but in the reasons that people gave for what it was that made an explanation deep, elegant, or beautiful. So in particular, many people appealed to something that we've heard of already tonight, Occam's Razor, some principle of parsimony or simplicity. So for example, if you just do a simple word count on these responses, the word simplicity appears over 50 times and the word simple appears over 100 times. The other theme that stands out, if you look at people's responses, was the idea that explanations are better the more they explain, the broader they are, the more they exhibit a property that I refer to as scope. So for example, one of the respondents suggested that the hallmark of a deep explanation is that it answers more than you ask. Right? We don't just want to understand some little local phenomenon, we really want to gain some kind of deeper understanding that allows us to see how that relates to broader patterns and regularities and so on. Now it turns out that we're all kind of picky when it comes to explanations. This isn't just the select group of scholars that was asked about their explanations. So if you look at the history of science, you can find many scientists advocating for these very same properties of explanations. So for example, here's a quote from Newton in the Principia where he suggests that we're to admit no more causes of natural things than such as are both true and sufficient to explain their appearances. So some notion of simplicity operating here. Here's a quote from the philosopher Weigel, who writes that the aim of scientific explanation throughout the ages has been unification, that is, the comprehending of a maximum of facts and regularities. There's a notion of breadth or scope there, in terms of a minimum of theoretical concepts and assumptions. So there we see some notion of simplicity. And in my own lab, and also research by other cognitive scientists, we find pretty good evidence that children and adults, everyday children and adults, not just the scientists and philosophers, also seem to have systematic preferences for explanations that are simple and explanations that have broad scope. So this raises the first of what I'm going to call 3 mysteries of explanation. And the first mystery is why it is that we're so picky about explanations, right? Why do we have these systematic preferences for some kinds of explanations over others? And in particular, why do we care that our explanations be simple and have broad scope? The second mystery of explanation is why it is that we bother explaining things at all. In particular, because most of the time, when we're explaining things that we've already observed. Right? So it's really clear why it might be valuable to be able to predict things about the future. But why should we engage in this very backwards-looking activity of trying to explain things that have already happened and that we've already observed? So just to give you some examples to make this concrete, I looked on Yahoo Answers, which some of you might be familiar with. This is a website where people can pose questions and answers. And here are some of the kinds of things that people look for explanations for. Why did dinosaurs become extinct? Why did the Spanish-American War start? Now these things already happened, right? The dinosaurs already became extinct. The war already happened. It'd be really useful to be able to predict when species are going to become extinct or when wars are going to happen. But why do we bother explaining things that already happened? And we also do this for really mundane cases. So for example, why did my boyfriend lie about this? He already lied about whatever it is he lied about. Nonetheless, we seem to be really driven to explain this thing that already happened. And this is also true for explanations for, not just for events, but for sort of patterns or regularities that we observe. So for example, why do dogs have tails? Why do we stereotype? If you're asking these questions, you've already made the observation and the generalization that in fact dogs tend to have tails and that we do stereotype. Right? So the second mystery is why it is that we engage in the seemingly sort of post hoc, backwards looking process of trying to make sense of things that we've already observed, that had already occurred, and so on. Now you might already have some ideas about how it is that we can respond to this mystery. And that is the idea that seeking explanations might actually foster learning in an important way. And I think this is true, but it'll lead us to the third mystery, as you'll see. So here's a quote I like from the philosopher Quine, where he suggests that the hypotheses that we seek in explanations of past observations serve again in the prediction of future ones. Curiosity thus has survival value despite having killed a cat. Right? So even though explanations seem like this very kind of backwards-looking sort of endeavor where we're accounting for things that we've already observed or that already happened, it seems like in the process of doing that, we might learn things that are going to allow us to predict when another species might become extinct or what might prevent another war and so on, right? So it seems like this backwards-looking activity is actually really helpful in allowing us to predict and control the future. My colleague, Alison Gopnik, who I think is speaking at the next laser, has a paper provocatively titled Explanation as Orgasm, where she suggests that explanation is to theory formation, as orgasm is to reproduction. It's the phenomenological mark of the fulfillment of an evolutionarily determined drive. Right? The idea is that part of the reason that we engage in explanation and have this sort of satisfying feeling of, aha, I get it now, is because that's what motivates us to engage in the kind of learning about the world that's going to, in fact, allow us to then predict and control it effectively. So perhaps that puts to rest part of the second mystery. But I think it actually raises another puzzle, which arises when you think about the many different ways that we learn through explaining. So in particular, some cases of learning by explaining exhibit a property that in my research I started calling learning by thinking. And I can illustrate this with a phenomenon that's been very well documented in the education literature, and that I think will be familiar to a lot of you here from your own experience. And that's what's called the self-explanation effect. Now, classically, the phenomenon is demonstrated with students learning about educational materials, and what you find is that students who explain, even to themselves, even just in their heads, even without any feedback at all on the accuracy of their explanations, seem to learn material better and to generalize it better to novel contexts than students who don't engage in explaining to themselves as they're studying. So any of you who is a teacher or a parent or has been a tutor or just tried to explain something to a friend or a colleague has probably had this experience that some of the time when you explain something to somebody else, you come to understand it better. Right? And I think in some ways we take this kind of experience for granted because it happens all the time, but when you think about it, it's actually really deeply mysterious. Because the way that we normally think about how learning works is something like this. There are some facts in the world, there are some facts in your head, and the way learning works is that somehow you transfer one of these facts in the world to your head, perhaps because you observe something new, or because somebody tells you something that you didn't know before. In a case where you learn by explaining, the picture is more like this. You're not getting new information from the external world. You're just explaining to yourself. Nonetheless, something about that rearrangement of the stuff that was already in your head can sometimes lead to genuinely new understanding. And so that takes us to the third mystery of explanation. So how it is that explanations can be productive in this particular way. Right? How is it that some of the time, just the process of engaging in explanation, even without new information from the external world, can support learning? So I want to suggest that this is actually really similar to other kinds of cases that people have thought about historically and in philosophy as well. And one of them is thought experiments. So a canonical thought experiment is one where you sit in your armchair and based on some sort of simulation in your mind, come to some new understanding or new insight. And most of the time, progress in science occurs by going out in the world and doing an experiment and gathering new data. But there have at least been some celebrated examples of cases where we seem to get some genuinely new insight, not from an experiment like that, but from a thought experiment. So Einstein had lots of thought experiments about elevators and trains and photons and so on that seem to play an important role in his theory development. Schrodinger's cat is another famous thought experiment. As you've seen from the last talk, philosophers can be very good at coming up with thought experiments to make particular points. I don't have zombies up here, but there's cases involving trolley cars running over people that you might have heard about, brains in bats, and so on. So I want to give you a more concrete demonstration of how it is that explaining might have this kind of effect by giving you just a couple of really quick examples of the kinds of experiments that we do in my lab to try to get at how it is that this process of explaining to yourself could possibly alter what it is that you learn. And so the first example I want to show you comes from collaborative work with Joseph Williams, who was a PhD student in my lab, is now a postdoc at Stanford. And in our first set of experiments, we taught people about two kinds of alien robots, glorps and drents. So if you were a participant in the lab, you would come in and you would be told that your task is to learn to differentiate glorps and drents, because I'm going to show you some new robots, and you're going to have to tell me if they're glorps or drents. So I'm going to give you a couple moments here to look at these. This is the audience participation part of the talk. Does anybody notice any differences between glorps and drents?
Well, they all have different colors.
They do have different colors, yeah.
And they have two shapes which are shared. Well, two basic shapes which are shared. The shapes that are shared. The shapes are an amalgam, but they are all of a kind, then put together differently.
Right. So they're all made of the same basic components, right?
Yes.
Different sort of component shapes. But any candidates for what it is that makes something a glorp versus a drent? Any sort of patterns to differentiate these? The label, actually, yes. Our participants have never offered that explanation, but it is a pretty good answer.
Yeah.
So our participants get more time to stare at these than I've given you. We have one more hand? We have two hands here.
The drent. No, sorry.
Okay, so there was almost an answer there, and then I'll go to the one over there. So the almost answer here was what I'm going to refer to as a 75% body pattern. So there is a real regularity here, which is that the glorps tend to be square and the drents tend to be round, but in each case there's an exception. So I'm going to refer to this as the 75% body rule, because if you use this, you'd be right 75% of the time, but you wouldn't be able to classify all of these correctly. There was another hand back there. Was it a different pattern or the same one?
Different one?
Okay, yes.
I was going to say that the drents have a flat surface pointing towards the bottom of their feet, and the glorps have like a point.
Excellent. All right, so we've had someone discover the 100% foot pattern. Great. So all of the feet are unique shapes, but all of the glorps have feet that come to a point at the bottom, and all of the drents have feet that are flat along the bottom. And if you discovered this pattern, which is deliberately meant to be kind of subtle, you would be able to classify all of these correctly. Okay, so what we were interested in is how the process of trying to explain to yourself what makes something a glorp or a drent would influence how effective you are at discovering these different kinds of patterns in what you have in front of you. So the way the experiment worked was like this. Participants would be introduced to all 8 of these as I introduced them to you. While they had all 8 of those available for reference, we would then go through the 8 one by one and ask them to do one of 2 things. In the explain condition, we would ask them to explain, for example, why do you think this might be a drent? Or why do you think this might be a glorp if it was in fact a glorp? And they would provide an explanation and receive no feedback on their explanation. We had a series of different control conditions where people were exposed to the exact same items for the same amount of time, but instead of prompting them to explain, we asked them to either describe that robot, to think aloud while they studied that robot, or to just engage in free study. We then had them classify new robots as glorps or drents, and we explicitly asked them, what is it that makes something a glorp or a drent? where we wanted to see in particular, had they discovered the foot pattern, the body pattern, or anything else. And what we found pretty consistently across these studies is that explanation seems to promote the discovery of broad patterns. In this context, just explaining to yourself without any feedback made people significantly more likely to discover this relatively subtle foot pattern. So here are the discovery rates along the y-axis. And people are split up into whether or not they were in the control condition or the explained condition. And across 3 experiments where we vary what people are doing in the control condition, we find that just a prompt to explain makes people 2 to 3 times more likely to discover this pattern in what they're observing. Turns out we find the same thing with preschool-aged kids. We had to change the task to make it a little bit more appropriate for 4 or 5-year-olds. These are studies with Karen Walker, Joseph Williams, and Alison Gopnik. And the way it worked was like this. Children were introduced to this device called a blanket detector. When some objects go on this machine, it lights up and plays music. When other objects go on this machine, nothing happens. They would observe a total of 8 objects that would be laid out in front of them like this, where these 4 over here all made the machine go, and those 4 over there all did not make the machine go. So hopefully you can maybe see a pattern here. It's a little less subtle than the case with the adults, but the logic is the same. So there is a 100% pattern here, which is that those blocks that have a green Lego on top do make it go, whereas those with a yellow Lego on top don't. There's also a 75% pattern, which is that those that have a red Lego in front tend to make it go, and those with a white Lego in front tend not to make it go. But again, there's an exception. So this is a 75% pattern. And here what we did is we had half the kids explain why it was that a particular block made the machine go each time a block was demonstrated on the machine. Or in a control condition, we just asked them, what happened to my machine when I put this one on? So again, we're drawing attention to the relationship between the blocks and the effects, but we're not asking them to explain. And then we basically asked them which of these patterns they thought was more important. But the way that we did that is we had an opaque bag and we said, you know, I see one in here that has green on it and one in here that has red on it. Which one do you think is going to make my machine go? And so that tells us which of these 2 patterns they think is more diagnostic of what's the underlying causal structure is here. And what we find mirroring the data with the adults is that the kids who were prompted to explain were significantly more likely to respond in a way that was consistent with a 100% pattern as opposed to 75% pattern. Okay, so I started out with this puzzle of how it is that you can learn by explaining to yourself. In the cases I just showed you, people did have new information. They learned about glorps and drents or about these new blocks. But all that we varied across conditions was whether or not we told half the participants to engage in this particular process with the information that they had, even though they were receiving no information that was different from the first group. Nonetheless, doing that resulted in a significant improvement in what it is that they learned. So, returning to these 3 mysteries of explanation, what I want to suggest is that actually these mysteries are related. That we can put them all together in a picture that helps us understand why it is that we're picky, why it is that explanations have this sort of post hoc character, and why it is that they're productive in this particular way. And the picture looks something like this. There's a lot of information in the world. Somehow we have to make sense of it, right? We have to structure it or organize it, because just having that is not very useful. We want to know about things like causal and taxonomic relationships, or about the relationships between different variables, or about how things should be clustered and categorized, and so on. And in order to do that, we need to know what kind of structure to look for in the data, how it is that we can make sense of it in a way that makes it usable and useful. And the idea is that what explanation does is it basically recruits a set of constraints or evaluative criteria for what kind of structure it is that we're looking for. And those evaluative criteria or constraints come from the very pickiness that I started out with. When we're trying to explain, we want something that gives us a satisfying sense of understanding, and that tends to be things that involve simplicity and broad scope. So when we engage in explanation, we're imposing a particular kind of constraint on what it is we're looking for and how it is that we're making sense of the data. So you can see all 3 elements here of the mysteries of explanation that I talked about. Explanations are sort of post hoc. They involve data that we already know about, right? But we have a lot of data available to us in our memory, sort of accumulated in our past experience. But that's not going to be very useful if it's not structured or organized in a way that allows us to see what the structure is that can then allow us to predict and control the future, to use that information effectively. So if you combine sort of our repository of background experience with the fact that explanations are very picky about what kind of structure we're looking for, you can actually get something new out of that process. That's where the productivity comes from, right? You can get some benefits to imposing this kind of structure and extracting structures from those cases. So to return to the example I've been talking about here, in this case over here, the idea is that by engaging in explanation, you're imposing particular kinds of constraints or preferences on the kind of structure you're looking for here. You want something broad and simple, right? And so the 75% pattern is going to be much less satisfying than the 100% pattern. And that's going to affect what it is you're looking for, how hard you look for it, when it is that you stop looking for it, and so on. And that's true as well for the developmental example that I showed you. So if this basic picture is right, then it gives us a story about why explanation is often such a powerful drive in science, right? By trying to look for particular kinds of explanations, you might end up with brilliant scientific discoveries, the sort of drive to unify different kinds of science. Explaining can be incredibly useful. But to the extent that the world, in fact, happens to be complex and idiosyncratic and doesn't actually support explanations that are satisfying, you might find that trying to engage in explanation can actually have negative effects. So in fact, we have a series of laboratory experiments where we've shown that there are particular conditions under which explaining can actually impair your learning, because it makes you really want something that's broad and simple. And if there's nothing broad and simple there, you're going to be misled. And sort of speculatively, a real-world case of this might be something like a conspiracy is interesting, and perhaps a little more mysterious than you might have thought. But I hope also to have given you a sense for why it is that we might in fact be so driven and motivated to seek explanations. I think the idea here is that explaining plays a really important role, not just in learning, by motivating us to seek new evidence, and by giving us a sort of satisfying sense of understanding when we found an explanation, but also by actively structuring the information that's already in our head in a way that gives us a sense of understanding and gives us something usable that we can then apply to the world. So thank you very much for your time.